Hello, all you gorgeous, amazing people. It's lovely to be back. It's been a couple of weeks, thanks to the holidays. Merry Christmas to you all, or Happy Holidays, however you celebrate. And a very Happy New Year too, if indeed it is the beginning of your new year. It is the beginning of my new year, 6th of January today. I've spent one day, the 1st of January, on a diet, and then the next 5 days just eating every single thing in the house, because that's what I do every single new year. So now I am just full of Cadbury's cream eggs. Cadbury's cream eggs are one of my favourite things in the world. Those of you in the UK will know that. I don't know if you have them in the States. They're like eggs, about the size of a small egg. Chocolate with I don't know what you'd call it inside. It's like gloopy white sugary stuff. It's probably got a name, but I don't know what it is. It's just pure deliciousness, and it's very easy to get addicted to them. And they usually come out at Easter, but obviously they've decided to release them a little bit early this year. What am I doing? Yes, I'm doing this. I'm on my phone today because I'm about to start reading. Sorry, it's bright again. January is really sunny. I'm going to start reading. Well, it looks like nothing, but there are words there, I promise you. There you go. The Fury 2, otherwise known as The Storm, otherwise known as the second half of The Fury, if you've got the American edition. This was so confusing. So basically what happened, I'll just explain, because I have explained this so many times in emails. Go away, son. You're banished. I'll sit back here. Basically what happened is I wrote The Fury. Fury got published in the UK. And then it got bought by the Americans. And while they were kind of umming and ahhing about how to format it, I wrote the second part of The Fury, The Storm. And then the Americans decided, my American publisher, who I love dearly, decided they were going to release both books as a monster, basically. A monster book. There you go, it's huge. With both The Fury and The Storm, with quite a few cuts, like nearly 700 pages long. And they decided they were going to do that. And because they'd already released The Fury in the UK, this is the UK edition. This is the UK edition. Because they'd already released that, they decided, well, what we really want to do is do what the Americans have done and release a compendium volume. Hiding behind Floyd there. So, the Brits scrapped the first book and released a big 700-page edition. But for people who'd already bought the first book, they thought it was a bit unfair. I thought it was a bit unfair to make people pay twice for the first book. So we ended up releasing The Storm, which is the second part, as an ebook. That was really confusing. So there are so many different editions of The Fury, but usually you've just got one. Everywhere now you go, you can find the compendium edition. In the UK, they called it the director's cut, which is ironic because I was like, you can't release this as one book, it's too big. Just release it as two books. So even though they called it the director's cut, it's not my version. So obviously there's another director out there who wanted to do this. Anyway, the most important thing is we're back, and you don't have to worry about any of that because I'm going to read it to you. The reason I'm reading this version rather than the compendium version is because this is the only version that kept the kind of UK spellings, just for consistency. And it's also got a few extra chapters that that you didn't find in the compendium edition that got cut just for the sake of keeping the book shorter than 1,000 pages. So we'll discover some chapters here that we wouldn't have done, and you won't have done if you've read the UK edition. I'm going to stop talking now. Actually, I'm not. I'm going to keep talking, but I'm going to stop talking rubbish. I'm going to start reading this book, which hopefully isn't rubbish. I bet you've missed this, haven't you? You've missed me just rambling on like a complete blithering idiot. Yeah, let's do it. So, shall I do a recap? I think if you've got this far, you probably know what's happened. Basically, there's this thing that makes people turn against you. So there's a few, like your mum, your dad, anyone, if they sense you nearby, they will just try and kill you. It's called The Fury. There's a bunch of kids and teenagers who have been infected by this. Every time they go near anyone else, apart from anyone else who's got the Fury, they get attacked. And they've started to realise that it's because there's something inside them. Now, they call this an angel, but I don't know what it is, but it's a presence inside them that creates this horrible reaction in people. But it's also gives them kind of powers. They can fly. Some of them can fly. Once this angel bursts out of you, as it has done with one person, which is Schiller, you get these kind of powers. And Schiller, at the end of the last book, basically just annihilated about 100 police officers just by blinking. I mean, he just imagined them just sort of dying, and they did in a series of really horrific ways. So the question now is, why has this happened to them? Why have they become a victim of the Fury? Why are these angels chosen them? And what is their purpose? Something to do with the man in the storm. So in the last book, they find a corpse. The police find a corpse. It is breathing in, but nobody knows where this air is going. It's not going into its lungs. And then suddenly this thing, basically on the way to a research lab to find out what it is, just explodes from the ambulance and just starts inhaling. And it is inhaling everything: people, cars, bits of road, houses. And it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I don't have reading glasses yet, even though I'm so old. I'm going to try and squint my way through this until I can get it to work on my iPad. And yeah, ooh, pretty. Way to confuse my camera. So anyway, I hope you've got a nice cup of tea or a drink. I've got a Coke today. Charred. As we venture into the fairly horrific and hopefully exciting world of the Fury 2. And at the end of the last book, Daisy was shot and she fell into the same kind of icy sleep as Schiller did. So we start there with Daisy. Daisy, Sunday, Hemingway, 11:56 p.m. Oh, and I should read the quote. Prologue. Nature, in her indifference, makes no distinction between good and evil. Anatole France, The Revolt of the Angels. Daisy, Sunday, Hemingway, 11:56 p.m. I can't believe I've been talking for 7 minutes, sorry. Daisy Bryan was everywhere and nowhere, possessed by a creature of fire and locked inside a world of ice. She didn't know how long it had been since she had fallen. Time didn't seem to have a place here, wherever she was. It could have been a handful of seconds or a million years. There was no way of telling. She hung inside a web of lives, an infinite number of them. They looked like ice cubes, and through the frosted surface of each one she could make out places and people. If she really tried, she could peer into the ice and make sense of those worlds, but doing that made her feel sick, as though she was in the back of a car going too fast around a bend. It was here with her, though, the creature, and it wanted her to look. She could feel it inside her head, something made of light. It didn't speak. Daisy didn't think it could speak, but it guided her, showing her the things that mattered, stopping her from drifting away into the endless ocean of ice. She saw the events of the last few days as if she was reliving them, not just her memories, but the memories of her new friends too: Cal, Brick, Adam, Marcus, Jade, even Rilke and Schiller. It had started the same way for all of them, even though they didn't know each other, even though they were hundreds of miles apart. A headache that had gone on for days. Thump, 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 thump. I've just realised this is actually a recap, so I didn't need to say all of that. Like somebody trying to break into their skulls. And the moment the headache had stopped, the fury had started. The whole world had wanted to kill them. She saw it inside the ice cubes. Cal running for his life as hundreds of people came after him at school, his best friends trying to tear him to pieces. And Brick sitting in the basement of an abandoned theme park with his girlfriend, about as happy as Brick could be until she started trying to bite out his throat. Adam, poor little Adam, who had never said a word since the fury started, had been at the dentist's, Jade in a taxi, Marcus at home, Rilke and Schiller, the twins, had been at a party, almost trampled into mud in the middle of the night. And her. She watched it now, although the slim 12-year-old she saw sobbing in her parents' bedroom didn't really seem like her, not anymore. Her mum and dad were dead beside her, propped up next to each other like dolls on a shelf. Her mum had done it, poisoning her dad and then herself. She had done it so she wouldn't hurt Daisy. She'd done it to protect her. It hadn't protected her from the ambulance people who'd arrived at her house, though, who wanted to murder her. She had only just escaped with her life. They all had. No, not all of them. How many had died? Daisy wasn't sure, but she knew that there had been others like her, dozens, maybe hundreds. They had been slaughtered by their friends, their families. Then the world had forgotten them, like they'd never existed. The thought was awful, and she turned away from the ice, but she couldn't escape the visions, not here, not in this place. She watched as Cal rescued her, as they drove up to the theme park where Brick waited, drawn there by some kind of instinct. Fursville. It had been falling apart and it smelled of damp and dead things, but it had been safe. It had been home. Until she arrived. Rilke. She'd shown up one morning with her brother. Schiller. The boy was frozen, literally locked in ice. Daisy had been scared of her from the start. She'd known that Rilke was dangerous. She didn't realise how dangerous, though, until Rilke had killed Brick's girlfriend, who was locked in the basement, and another feral. She had shot them in cold blood. She'd claimed that the fury was happening because they, her, Schiller, Daisy, all of them, were no longer human. They were changing into something else, she'd said, something incredible. She'd been crazy, but she'd been right. Schiller had been the first to change. Daisy had seen it with her own eyes. He had woken from his sleep not as a boy, but as a creature made of fire, a creature whose eyes burned, a creature with wings. An angel. Only not. It wasn't an angel like in the stories her mum had once told her, not a cherub with a harp and a halo. It was something older than time, something immensely powerful, so powerful that it couldn't live here in their time and space without a host. That's why it needed Schiller. They all had one, living inside them. That's what made them special. It's what made the rest of the world hate them so much. Daisy could feel hers. It was on the verge of waking, just like Schiller's had. Cal, Brick, Adam, Rilke, all of them. They had angels in them. Sooner or later they would hatch, and they too would be made of fire. They would be able to pull reality apart with just a thought. Daisy shivered, even though it wasn't cold here. She didn't think she even had a body wherever she was. She had been shot by a policeman. She and the others had gone to look for food, but they'd been attacked by the ferals, hundreds of them. It had been Rilke's fault. She'd called the police. Rilke had wanted them to be attacked. She'd said it was the only way for them to see the truth about why they were changing. That it was their job to wipe humankind from the face of the planet. And she'd shown them how. Daisy didn't have to watch it in the ice. Every detail of it was etched into the flesh of her brain. Schiller, drenched in fire, floating above the ground, his eyes 2 pockets of starlight. He had twitched his fingers and turned the crowds of ferals into ash, hundreds of them, and scattered all that they were to the wind. And he had spoken. Not him, but his angel, a word that had no place here, which had unknitted the world, unmade reality. His voice had wiped the land clean all the way to the horizon. It had rocked time and space and left the universe trembling. Rilke had taken that as proof that she was right. But she wasn't. Daisy was sure of it. The angels were strong, but they weren't evil. They weren't anything. She couldn't sense any emotion there at all in the thing that squatted in her soul. They could only do what they were told to. They were more like machines sent to put things right. Because something else was very wrong. Something she couldn't even bear to think about. She saw it now in the corner of her eye, an iceberg that crashed and cracked towards her, something inside it that made her want to scream. The man in the storm. He had arrived at the same time as the angels, only he had been born inside a corpse. He hung in a hurricane and sucked up the world through the black hole of his mouth, devouring everything. Daisy didn't know exactly where he was, but she knew thousands had already died, pulled into the churning vortex, their whole lives made nothing. He was the reason they were here. She was sure of it. They had to fight him before he swallowed them all. "Is that it?" she asked the creature. "Please tell me." If it answered, she couldn't understand it. She felt so alone, and she sought comfort in another vision, this one happening right now. 3 boys sleeping inside a beaten-up car. She pulled herself closer to the ice, seeing Cal and Brick and Adam all dreaming the same dream. She was there too. Her body, anyway, lying in the boot, cocooned in ice. What would it be like, she wondered, when the angel burst from her chest? Would it hurt? Would she know what to do? All she knew was that soon the angel would wake, that she too would be a thing of fire and fury, and the man in the storm would be waiting for her. I'm so busy. And now introduced to a new character, Rowley. Monday, Hemsby, 12:22 a.m. Rowley Highland was drunk. He staggered down the beach, an evening full of cheap rum making the world reel with every step. At one point he missed his footing entirely and sprawled forwards, landing on his face. For some reason he found it insanely funny, giggling into the soft, cool sand. What felt like half a year later he pushed himself up, realising he'd dropped his bottle somewhere. It was almost pitch black here, just the faintest hint of moonlight making it through the clouds. The sea was right in front of him, as dark and as flat as slate. He could hear it whispering, urging him towards it. He didn't like the sea, not since he'd almost drowned in it when he was 11. "Can't hurt me now, though," he slurred as he teetered back to his feet, "'cause I'm drunk." He gave up on the rum. There had only been a couple of mouthfuls of backwash anyway, and set off to his left. His best mates Lee and Connor were out here somewhere, plus Connor's new girl, Hayley. Rowley's 13-year-old brother Howie was around as well, although he'd wandered off an hour or so ago claiming he wasn't feeling too good. That was the rum. It did that to you. Rowley's head had been thumping for most of the night too. "Hey!" he called out into the darkness. Something erupted upwards from nearby, the flap of its wings like somebody clapping. The silence it left behind, broken only by that same endless whisper of the waves, was almost spooky. "Ooh," he said, nearly falling flat on his face again, scuttling crab-like on his hands until he found his feet. The others were probably hiding, planning to jump out at him or something, but he wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. "Because I'm invincible," he shouted, his words swallowed by the sea. He giggled again, thinking of how impressed they'd be when they failed to scare him. Connor was 2 years older, 17 now, and there were times when Rowley felt like a total baby in front of him. That's why he'd drunk so much tonight. He'd matched his friend drink for drink and was still standing. Connor had to be impressed by that. And Hayley too. She was proper fit, and maybe if he impressed her enough tonight, then she'd dump Connor and go out with him instead. Only if he could find them, though. Where the hell were they? "Oi!" he screamed, lobbing a few choice swear words into the night. The beach had been pretty deserted all evening, which was weird considering it was Sunday, smack bang in the middle of summer. It was probably something to do with whatever had happened along the coast earlier. There had been some kind of explosion north of here, apparently, somewhere up by the old Fursville theme park. Rowley hadn't seen anything, but he'd felt the tremors at about 7. "Mines," Connor had said matter-of-factly. They'd been sitting in the older boy's flat, and the blast had been so powerful that the windows had rattled. "Huh?" Lee had said. "They're old sea mines from the war and stuff. They find them all the time. They probably just blew one up." They'd all nodded, and that had been that. Connor was 17 now, and he was going to join the army. He knew all about explosives and stuff like that. God, that all seemed like years ago. Rowley staggered onwards, gulping down salted air and trying to remember what else had happened that evening. Already some of it was fading away like disappearing ink. "Screw you guys," he called out, fed up with their games. "I'm going home." He stopped, reeling from side to side in an effort to work out which way led back to town. The sea lay to his right, vast and black and menacing, so he steered his stubborn legs left towards the dunes. A soft breeze kicked up grains of sand, carrying them into his mouth, where they crunched between his teeth. He muttered curses as he struggled on the crumbling ground, grabbing rope-like strands of seagrass to help haul himself off the beach. Once he was over the hump of the dune, the going was easier, and he stumbled round down the other side, wondering if there was any way of getting another drink. The first line of Hemsby's rubbish wooden beach bungalows was in sight when he heard voices up ahead. Or were they voices? They sounded more like grunts and whispers. Dogs, maybe. He ducked down onto one knee, planting his hand in the earth to stop himself tumbling. Was it his imagination, or was the air suddenly colder? He shivered, tilting his head and waiting to see if the noises came again. They did. A distant, snorting squeal that belonged in the slaughterhouse up the road. There were footsteps too, fast and hard, coming this way. It had to be Connor and Lee taking the piss. They were probably still trying to scare him, and it was working. His pulse tripping, the pleasant numbness of the rum starting to wear away. "Oh, man up, Rowley," he told himself. He couldn't look scared, not in front of the others. They'd never let him forget it. He rose unsteadily, creeping onto the tarmac road which seemed to sprout organically from the beach. He walked around a bungalow as the noises grew louder, wondering how long it would be before the lights came on inside and the owners started yelling at him the way they did most weekends. The road curled around to the right, widening into the beachside promenade up ahead. There were streetlights there, forming puddles of sickly yellow light which seemed to make the shadowed parts of the street even darker. Another cry barked out from between two shuttered arcades 50 metres away. those hammered footsteps getting closer. Then somebody shouted, a voice so full of grief and terror that Rowley didn't recognise it until a figure skidded out onto the road, slipping on the sandy tarmac and crumpling into a heap. "Howie?" Rowley said, watching his little brother scrabble for a footing. What the hell was he up to? Howie lifted his head. He was still some distance away, but there was something wrong with his face. His mouth hung open, surely too wide, his eyes huge and white and wild. Rowley took a step forward, adrenaline stripping the last of the alcohol in his system and leaving him as sober as he had ever felt in his life. "Howie!" he called out. "What's wrong?" There were more footsteps, he realised, coming from the same direction. His brother made it to his feet and started running towards him, his arms wheeling, just as Connor sprinted out from between the arcades. The older kid didn't even stop for breath as he turned up the street towards Rowley. Haley followed. Then Lee, then some guy that Rowley had never seen before in his life, all of them legging it towards him at full pelt. Something really bad had to have happened, because they all looked as though they were seething with anger. Not anger, he thought. Fury. His brother had halved the gap between them now, foam spraying from his lips. Connor was closing in on him fast, uttering the same guttural wet barks. The urge to turn and bolt was so strong that Rowley almost went, but he couldn't leave his brother. "Howie, what's wrong?" he asked. Howie didn't answer, just kept running, pounding down the street in the hand-me-down Nikes that Rowley had given him last Christmas. They all kept running, a tide of people surging along the promenade with nothing but hatred in their faces. "Howie!" he said again, his voice cracked and broken. "Howie!" Howie seemed to see him for the first time, and his expression flooded with relief. "Rowley!" he cried. "Help me!" Even as the words left Howie's mouth, Connor reached him, grabbing a handful of his t-shirt. They tripped on each other, falling hard in a tangle of limbs. Rowley ran at them, watching in disbelief as Connor drove his knuckles into Howie's cheek. Even 25 metres away he heard the dull thump. Howie cried out, his hands slapping at his attacker, his eyes locked on Rowley, silently screaming, "Help me, help me, help me!" "Hey!" Rowley yelled, still sprinting, 20 metres away now. "Get off it!" His world turned inside out. A soft, dark explosion inside his head that seemed to burn every single thought into oblivion. Every thought but one. Kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it. The boy on the ground wasn't his brother. It wasn't even human. Disgust boiled in his stomach, raging into a white-hot fury that drove him down the street. Time slowed, everything perfectly quiet compared to the sapper's fire that flared in the very centre of his mind. Only one thing was important. There was only one thing in the entire world that he had to do. Kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it. Because this thing was wrong. It was his enemy. It was something that shouldn't be, that couldn't be. Kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it. Something there inside that bag of flesh that had to be obliterated. Kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it. He fell to his knees, driving his fists into the squirming shape again and again, tearing at it with his nails, his teeth, with every weapon he had, wanting just to kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it, wanting it to be gone, to be dead, feeling as though he wouldn't be able to breathe again until he killed it, like he was drowning, his lungs screaming. And the only way he'd be able to get to the surface again was to kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it. He punched and scratched and gouged and choked and fought and dreamed of the breath he could take when it was dead and raged and raged and raged. Kill it, 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 kill it. Howie couldn't feel the punches anymore. He couldn't feel anything. It was as if he was sinking into a grave, dark and numb and cool and peaceful. His thoughts were ravaged, torn to shreds, but in those pieces he saw what had happened. The headache he'd had for days now suddenly vanishing, and then they'd turned on him without warning. Lee, Haley and that idiot Connor, throwing themselves at him outside the hardware shop, howling like animals. He wasn't even sure how he'd got away the first time. He'd just put his head down and run. He was good at running, he always had been. But Connor had been faster. And Rowley, his brother, how could he be on it? How could he be in on it? How he felt his head snap to the side, and for an instant he was out of his grave, back on the street. He wasn't sure if his eyes were open or if he was just imagining it, but he could see Rowley now, kneeling next to him, his knuckles red. That's my blood on his hands, Howie understood. He's stealing it. He tried to call his brother's name, But he was 6 feet under again, or at least it felt that way. Worms as tough as fingers burrowing into his skin. I don't want to die, Rowley, he thought, hoping the words would reach his brother, even though they would never find their way out of his mouth. He was only 13. He hadn't even kissed a girl yet, or had to go on Lee's dad's quad bike like he'd been promised. It's not my time yet. Just stop. Stop. At least he was numb down here. It was getting darker, like somebody was throwing spadefuls of soil onto him. The thought was terrifying, and the shock of adrenaline that followed brought him back for an instant, the street once again there in shades of yellow and grey and red. Fists and feet rose and fell like pistons, like he was stuck inside an engine, and somewhere in his shattered mind he fumbled at gears, trying to drive himself away. Howie lifted a hand, wondering why his skin sparkled like he was wearing a suit of ice. Rowley slapped it aside, preparing for another strike. It never came. His brother's arm disintegrated, becoming a cloud of ash which hung in the air for a moment, before spiralling slowly to the street. Rowley didn't even notice. He just attacked with the stump of his wrist and his other fist. The fingers of his left hand came apart, leaving trails of red and white in the air like streamers. Then the rest of his body came undone, dissolving like a sculpture of salt thrown into a hurricane. Howie couldn't move his head, but in the corner of his vision he saw Connor melt away into the night. The soft breeze made the boy's ashes dance in looping circles. 2 more soft pops followed, and the air was a shimmering haze of dust. Is he alive? The words seemed to come from a million miles away. Somebody crouched down beside him, a girl, brushing powdered bone from her skirt. She put her hand to his head, leaving it there for a moment. Howie tried to nuzzle against it, but she pulled her fingers away, wrapping them in her other hand. He's freezing, she said. He's one of us. Thank you, Howie wanted to say. The words were forgotten, though, when a boy appeared beside her. Where his eyes should have been, there were pockets of fire, blue and gold and fierce. The inferno consumed his whole body, and from his back stretched 2 huge, perfect wings, as pure and as bright as the sun. An angel, Howie thought, and he wondered if he had died. Then the boy blinked, and the fires burned out. No, you're not dead, the angel boy said. You'll be okay. We'll look after you. Get him up, said the girl. Howie felt hands under him, lifting him, and there was no pain. My name is Rilke. This is Schiller. You're going away somewhere now, but it won't be for long. When you wake up again, well... She smiled, but Howie couldn't quite work out what was in that smile. You'll have fire too, she said. Don't be scared. You've been chosen. He wasn't scared, even though his vision was darkening, cotton wool in his ears. It didn't feel as though he was sinking into a grave this time. It was more like lying in a bed and drifting off to sleep, warm and comfy and safe. The girl, called Rilke, placed her hand on the angel boy's cheek, offering him the same smile. You're getting good at this, little brother, she said. Thank you, he replied. Let's go, she went on. Burn it all. Don't leave anything except sand. And that was the last thing Howie heard before sinking into sleep, already dreaming of the fire that would be his when he woke. The other part 1, although this is technically the other part 4. These were the chapters in the last book that dealt with the man in the storm. And when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them, and shall overcome them, and kill them. Book of Revelation. Graham is another new character. Monday, London, 5:45 a.m. The sound of the phone wormed its way into his dream, and for a moment he was floundering in an ocean full of bells. Then he was awake, switching on his lamp and groping in the dark for the mobile beside his bed. He had it halfway to his ear before he noticed it wasn't making the noise, and that realisation blasted the last few scraps of sleep away. It was his other phone, the bad things phone. He swore, tumbling out of bed and ignoring the murmured protests from his boyfriend. The ringtone cut through his head, its cry shrill and relentless. Bad things, bad things, bad things, his mind sang along as he rummaged through the suit trousers hanging on the wardrobe door. He ripped out the mobile, the vibrations making it feel like a living thing trying to squirm free. He almost dropped it. Better to let it go than to find out why it was ringing. Instead, he flipped it open, shows how old this book is, and put it to his ear. "This is Hayling," he said, although the introduction was pointless. The caller knew he was Graham Hayling, Chief Officer of the Army's Counter-Terrorism Division, otherwise he wouldn't have dialed this number, because this number was for emergencies, not your average run-of-the-mill serial killer or arson or train crash or bank robbery emergencies, but code-red, critical, end-of-the-world emergencies. Bad things. "Sir." The voice belonged to Erica Pierce, his second-in-command, only it sounded somehow hollow, dead. "Don't say it," he prayed. "Please don't say it." But she did. "Something's happened." "An attack?" he asked, using his shoulder to pin the phone to his ear while he scrambled into his trousers. Erica sighed, and he could picture her chewing her bottom lip. In the pause that followed, he heard the echo of sirens on the line. "I think so," she said eventually. "It's bad," he thought, when she didn't finish. It couldn't be worse than 7-7, though, could it? That was the last time he'd had to pick up this phone, only that time he'd been in Mallorca, and they'd flown him home in a VC-10. He glanced at the bed. David propped up on one elbow, blinking at him. "Where?" he asked Erica. "London," she replied. "Somewhere on the M1, we can't be sure yet." Can't be sure meant that they couldn't get near, and that scared Graham so much he slumped onto the edge of the mattress. Can't be sure meant dirty bombs, or worse, it meant contamination. "We've sent 2 teams up," she went on. "Neither's come back. There's something... It's not right." "I'll be right there, Erica," he said. "Don't be scared." And that was just about the stupidest thing he could ever have said to Erica Pierce, who'd come top of her academy class at just about everything, who'd single-handedly uncovered a plot to smuggle liquid explosives onto a Navy carrier, and once punched a suspect so hard that she'd broken his jaw. But the voice on the phone didn't sound like his partner's. It sounded like a child's, lost and frightened. "No," she replied. "Don't. I wasn't calling you to get you here. I was calling you so you could get away." "What?" he said. "Erica, what are you talking about? Listen, I'm leaving the house now. Just hang on." "I won't be here," she said, a ghost's whisper. "I'm sorry, Graham." He said her name again before he realised she'd hung up. What the hell? He looked at the phone as if somehow it could tell him more, then tucked it into his pocket and tightened his belt. "What's wrong?" said David, rubbing his eyes. "Nothing," he lied, pulling yesterday's shirt over his head and throwing a jacket on top. He didn't bother searching for socks. He just slipped his shoes on, the leather cold and unpleasant against his skin. "I've got to go. I'll call you when I know." He took 3 steps towards the bedroom door when something stopped him, a pressure in his stomach. It felt like a rope, one that had wound itself around his guts and was anchoring them tight. Fear, he told himself. And that was true, but this was something else, something more. "I was calling you so you could get away," Erica had said. "Get away. Get away. Get away." He turned back to David, wanted nothing more than to take his hand and run and keep running. Instead, he walked out of the bedroom and down the landing to the apartment's front door. Outside, dawn had failed. Where sunlight should have been pouring over the lip of the world, there was only a muted haze. It hung in the air, rotten, the colour of a dead man's skin. The sensation in Graham's gut intensified, his pulse racing, that same nervous chant, "Bad things, bad things, bad things," battering the inside of his skull like a trapped bird. There were too many people here, he realised. At this hour there should have been a sprinkling of delivery drivers and market sellers and the last dismal dregs of the drunken clubbers. But the street was full, cars gridlocked and honking all the way up to the store on the corner where a white van straddled both lanes, engine smoking. He was amazed the noise hadn't woken him sooner. A crowd was pushing up the pavement, weaving in between the motionless traffic as people made their way towards Gospel Oak Tube. Everyone was moving east, and when Graham turned his head to see where they were coming from, he understood why. Over the rooftops and the trees of Hampstead Heath, the sky was broken. Smoke churned upwards, a vortex so thick and so dark it could have been granite. It looked like a tornado, only it must have been 2 miles wide, maybe more. It rotated slowly, almost gracefully, forming a pool of oil-coloured cloud over his head. Explosions detonated inside the column, but they had no light. Whip cracks of black lightning that left traces on Graham's vision, dark spots when he blinked. Every time they flashed, they rent the air apart, revealing what was inside the vortex. Or rather, what wasn't inside it. Nothing. Graham thought, feeling as though he were teetering on the edge of some vast, awful madness. There is nothing there. It wasn't just empty, it was utterly, utterly void. He could make out slivers of a sky that weren't dark and weren't light. There weren't anything at all. It looked as if a mirror had been smashed, shards shaken loose to reveal the truth behind. Another blast of negative light sliced through the vortex, cutting a silhouette into the smoke. Was that a person in there? It was too big, surely, too high off the ground, yet it was there, a figure in the very centre of the maelstrom, a man in the storm. Graham was miles away from it, and yet he felt as though that man was looking right at him with eyes of inverted fire. They burned into him, the darkness seeming to expand in his vision until he was blind. It doesn't matter, he heard himself think. It's better that I can't see, better that I just... Something thumped into him, sending him stumbling back into the door of his apartment block. The woman muttered an apology, dragging a screaming child down the road after her. Graham caught his breath, shaking some of the darkness out of his eyes. He almost looked up again before stopping, putting a hand up to shield himself from the skies. Whatever it was over there, it was a bad thing, a really bad thing, and it was his job to make sure bad things didn't happen. He turned away, flicked open his phone and hit the first number of his address book. It rang just once before somebody answered, and Graham didn't give them a chance to speak. "Get me General Stevens," he said, "and tell him we're under attack." Dawn. And where two raging fires meet together, they do consume the thing that feeds their fury. William Shakespeare, The Taming of the Shrew. Cal. And I think this is us back to the regular cast now. Cal. Hemingway. 6:01 a.m. Pieces of broken world were still falling when Cal opened his eyes. They drifted down onto the windscreen of the Freelander, forming a translucent layer that looked like snow, but which he knew was actually rock and metal and powdered flesh. He sat up, his back numb from a night in the passenger seat, his feet full of needles. The entire car wore a jacket of dust, all except for the broken driver's side window. Through it, the land had turned the colour of bone, blanketed in the same fine powder. It was like every single thing on earth had been erased. Every single thing except us, he thought. It had to be morning, though, because parchment yellow light streamed into the car, and there were birds too, he realised, singing so loud and so hard he wondered if that's what had woken him. They had short memories, the birds. They'd already forgotten what had happened. Not him, though. He had spent the night dreaming of it over and over and over again. The police, the fury, and Schiller, the boy in the fire. The angel. Cal shook his head, easing his aching neck around to see Adam lying across the back seat. The little boy was out cold, shivering in his sleep. It was no wonder. Daisy lay in the Freelander's boot, smothered in coats and blankets and pretty much everything else they could find, but still ice cold, literally ice cold. The chill coming off her had frosted the inside of the tailgate window, had turned the leather seats into crystal. The poor girl had been shot. She'd taken a bullet in the shoulder from one of the few policemen who hadn't gone feral, and now... She was changing, Cal knew. Schiller had gone through the same thing, imprisoned in ice before he was gripped by fire. Daisy was in some kind of cocoon, and when she woke, she'd be just like him. Sooner or later, they all would. No, he told himself. Not like him, not killers. The memories were making him sweat, despite the cold. He popped open the door, an avalanche of dust sliding free, filling his eyes and nose and mouth. He clambered out, spitting, ignoring the protests from his cramped back. At least his finger felt better, stiff but not painful. His nose, too. He didn't think anything was broken. Winter had risen overnight, the world covered by the same snow-grey sheet. Dark clouds scarred the cold blue sky. Not rain clouds, not storms, just earth and cars and trees and people blown to atoms, lighter than air. Clumps danced their way back to the land, only to be kicked up again by the breeze that whispered in off the sea. We need to go. The voice didn't seem to have any place out here, and it made Cal jump. He turned, looking over the Freelander's bonnet to see Brick standing there. The older boy's ginger hair was the brightest thing in sight, glinting like copper. A trail of footprints spiralled out around him, curling around the boarded-up toilet block all the way up the dunes. Once upon a time this place had been a car park, Cal remembered. The place where he and Daisy had first met Brick. How long ago had that been? 3 days. It felt like forever. The entire universe had been turned upside down and shaken like a snow globe. Now, Brick said, his tone just as blunt and infuriating as always. Been here too long. Morning to you too, mate, Cal replied, running his fingers down the bonnet and leaving grooves in the dust. Up close he could see the different colours there, brown and silver and red. So much red. Blood, muscle, brain, all reduced to powder by the power that had blazed from Schiller's new body. That power that had blazed from Schiller's new body. It couldn't have been possible, and yet here it was, all around him, life made dust by the blink of a burning eye. Only it hadn't really been Schiller, had it? He was the one who'd turned, but it was his sister who'd forced him to kill so many. Rilke, he spat, remembering some of the last words he'd heard her speak. But it told you why we are here, didn't it? To wage war with humanity. Schiller's eyes had burned, yes, but the insanity in Rilke's own gaze had scared Cal far more. What about her? Asked Brick. Rilke's long gone, isn't she? Cal nodded. He wasn't sure how he knew, but she was miles away from Hemingway. He could almost see her walking with Schiller and Marcus and Jade, leaving a trail of death in her wake. Or maybe that was just his imagination. He wished Daisy would wake. She'd know for sure which way Rilke had headed. Daisy knew things like that, even when nobody told her, but Daisy was frozen, and when she woke, she'd be something else entirely. We need to talk, Cal said, scuffing his trainer on the ground. About what happened. We need to think of a plan. Brick snorted a humourless laugh, running a hand through his hair and giving himself a pale halo of powder. They hadn't spoken much at all last night. They'd been too exhausted. They'd found the car, climbed inside, and fallen asleep. We don't need to talk, he said. We just need to move. Been here too long, slept right through, the God knows how. It was weird. They'd slept for almost 12 hours straight. Shock did that to you, though, Cal guessed. Knocked you out so that the body could recover. But Rilke, Schiller, they're killing people, Cal said. We need to tell someone at least. The police? Duh, they killed about 100 cops last night, Brick said. I think the police know. There's nothing we can do. You saw what he did. Brick seemed to choke on the words, and Cal knew what he was seeing. People bundled up by invisible arms, smashed into each other until all that remained was a spinning ball of compressed flesh. A helicopter crumpled, its pilot still inside. An explosion that obliterated everything from horizon to horizon. And Schiller, hanging above the ground, lost inside an inferno, commanding it all. How the hell can we stop that? Brick asked when he'd recovered. I can't believe Rilke even let us go. Because whatever Schiller was, they were too. You'll see, Cal, Rilke had said. It might take a day, it might take a week, but you will see. And he would. He knew that one day he too would go cold, and then something terrible would break through his soul. Oh, he shuddered, realising that Brick was still talking. We show up now, we get in her way, and she'll just set Schiller on us. One word from her and we're... He scooped up a handful of ash from the bonnet of the car, letting it trail from his fingers. Then, disgusted, he rubbed his palm down his filthy jeans, glaring at Cal like everything was his fault. I haven't got through all of this just to get killed by her pet dog. We need to get out of here, and whichever direction she's gone, we go the other way. What about Daisy? Cal asked. She needs help. Brick glanced towards the back of the Freelander. She's going to be like Schiller, isn't she? He said. Cal didn't reply. They both knew the answer to that. She's got one of those things inside her. An angel, said Cal. Brick snorted again. That's what Rilke said they were, but she doesn't know anything. She's talking crap. But Daisy had said it too, thought Cal, and she had known the truth. She'd known other things too. What if Daisy was right, Cal said. What if there is a reason we're here, to fight whatever it was she saw? The man in the storm, she'd called it. Yeah, Cal, sure. The world is in peril and it's you, me and a couple of kids destined to save it. I'm tired. I just want all this to be over. Cal nodded, looking up at the trees. Most of the needles had been blown off by the explosion and the birds, perched on branches like pine cones, had nowhere to hide. They still sang, though. There was a message in there somewhere, he thought. He leaned against the Freelander, the metal frozen. It was his mum's car. He'd stolen it when everything had kicked off to get him out of the city. The last time he'd seen her was in the rear-view mirror as she'd screamed and raged and tried to murder him. She would have killed him if she'd been able to. She would have torn him to pieces and then gone inside and put away her shopping like nothing had happened. The fury. "You think everyone still wants to kill us?" he asked Brick. Bigger Boy shrugged. "Think people have bigger fish to fry now with Rilke out there. Maybe they won't even notice us." He paused, spat, almost smiled. "Hell, if she has her way, maybe there won't be anyone left to notice us." It was a smile without humour, though, and when he wiped his face again, his tears left streaks in the dirt. Cal turned away, pretending not to notice. "OK," he said. "Let's go. Just get away from here, from Rilke. We can figure out what to do on the way." "You think the car will still work?" Brick asked, sniffing. Cal climbed back into the driver's seat, fishing the keys from his pocket. The Freelander had taken a proper battering on the way up here from London, but Schiller's onslaught didn't seem to have reached it. He flicked the ignition, grinning when the engine spluttered, whined, then finally caught. There was a rustle from the back, and he turned to see Adam there, sitting up in his seat and looking around with wide, wet eyes. "It's OK, mate," Cal said, leaving the car in neutral so that he could take his foot off the clutch and shuffle around. "You're safe. It's Cal, remember?" Adam nodded, relaxing a little, but still not blinking. "Do you have nightmares?" The kid nodded again. He hadn't spoken since he turned up at Fursville. It didn't look like he was about to start any time soon. "Me too," Cal went on. "But they're just dreams. They can't hurt us. You're safe here with me and Brick. Daisy too. She's sleeping just over there." Adam glanced into the boot, reaching down to touch Daisy's face. He quickly pulled his hand away, putting his fingers to his lips. "She's OK," Cal said. "She's... You know the story of Sleeping Beauty, right? That's what's happened to Daisy. She'll wake up soon, I promise you. Would you put your seatbelt on for me, Adam?" The boy did as he was told, as meekly as a beaten dog. Brick opened the passenger door, angling his lanky body inside and slamming it behind him. It took a couple of attempts to get it shut, and by that time the car was full of dust, countless cremated dead swimming in their ears and mouths and noses. Cal lowered his window, stuck the car in gear and steered it through the car park, leaving a perfect circle of tyre tracks in the ash. "You know where we're going?" Brick asked. The car rocked down the potholed path that led through the trees, back to the coast road. "Cal," Brick said. "I know where we're going," he replied, as they reached the road, checking that the coast was clear before heading south, away from Fursville. He thought about Daisy and her coffin of ice, and about the creature inside her, the angel. A hospital wouldn't help her. Not the police, not the army neither. There was only one place he could think of where they might find answers. He put his foot down, the car accelerating and dragging a flowing cloak behind it. Then he looked at Brick and said, "We need to find a church." How are we doing? I'll read one more. Rilke, Caister-on-Sea, 7:37 a.m. They were vermin, all of them. Men and women and children teemed over the dead grass of the holiday park, their eyes black and small and empty, their teeth bared. They swarmed from caravans and chalets and cars, blind to anything but their own hate. Some tripped and were quickly drowned in the stampede. More thumped into each other, the slap of flesh against flesh, almost as loud as the thunder of footsteps. Others shrieked and howled, the air alive with the cries of the damned. And they were damned. There was no doubt about that. "Are you ready, little brother?" Rilke asked, turning to Schiller. He stood, stooped next to her, pale and frightened and weak. He looked so tired, the flesh of his face loose, the corners of his mouth turned down like a sad clown's. The ground shook as the ferals flocked closer, the first of them, a huge hairy ape of a man dressed in shorts and a vest, now 10 metres away, close enough to smell. Oh, how she hated them, these parasites. Once upon a time she would have been scared, but not any more. Now there was only fury, her fury, as white and as hot and as dangerous as their own. "Schiller," she said, "do it." "Please, Rilke," he started, but she cut him off, grabbing his arm and twisting hard. Behind him stood Jade and Marcus with faces like sheep. The new boy, the one they'd found in Hemsby, lay between them, still frozen. Rilke turned back to her brother. "Do it!" Schiller might have been reluctant, but the creature inside him was eager. Her brother's eyes blazed. so bright that it looked as though a furnace had been fired up inside his skull. In a heartbeat, the flames had spread a second skin that wrapped him in an angry light, and he opened his mouth in a silent scream of fire. With a snap like a pistol shot, his wings punched through his shoulders, blasting out a shockwave that kicked up dust and sand and sent the first line of ferals rolling back into the crowd. Those wings beat slowly, almost lazily, forged of flame. The sheer power there made the air tremble, a generator hum that seemed to pull reality apart. Rilke had to bite her tongue and screw her eyes shut to stop the vertigo, and when she looked again, Schiller was already at work. There had to be 100 of them, fast and hard and angry. They didn't seem scared by Schiller's transformation. If anything, it seemed to incense them even further. They threw themselves at the burning boy, hands like claws, the same awful guttural cries barked from their throats. 100 of them, and they never stood a chance. Schiller opened his arms, the air around him shimmering. He was hovering off the ground now, ripples spreading outwards over the dirt like it was water. The hairy man came apart with a soft pop, his atomized body holding its shape for a fraction of a second before drifting away. Others ran through his floating remains before disintegrating with the same speed, the sound like somebody playing with bubble wrap. But still they kept coming, until a churning cloud hung before Schiller, as dark and as thick as smoke. "Rilke!" She turned to see Jade screaming as more ferals approached from behind them. A couple of teenage boys led this crowd. Both threw themselves on Marcus, tumbling into a tangle of limbs and teeth. 3 more followed, piling onto the skinny boy until he was lost. Others ran for Jade, and more still turned towards Rilke. "Don't be afraid of them. They are rats," she ordered herself, but the fear turned her legs to stone. She didn't have Schiller's powers, not yet. She was still a pathetic human, 9 pints of blood in a paper shell. They would tear her apart as easily as pulling petals from a plant. "Schill!" she cried. A woman leapt for her, tripping on one of Marcus's flailing arms and falling short. A man followed, raking nails across her face and making her stumble backwards. Then she was falling, the man's other hand grabbing for her throat, his eyes black pits of utter hatred. She never hit the ground. The air beneath her grew solid, holding her up. The man was moving, but impossibly slowly. His fingers were almost frozen in front of her neck, like a piece of film playing at 1/10 of the right speed. She could see the dirt beneath his nails, the tarnished sovereign ring on his pinky finger. Spittle flew from his lips, rising almost gracefully, hanging in the sun like a dewdrop. Everything seemed to have stopped, time grinding reluctantly along its axis. One of the ferals sitting on Marcus was lifting a fist, a pearl of dark blood suspended from her knuckles. Others were still approaching, their sprint now a snail's crawl. Rilke found herself laughing, her own movements sluggish too, as though she was swimming in a lake of treacle. She was still falling, she realised, but so slowly that it felt as though she was still. Only Schiller was immune. He floated through the crowds until he was standing next to Rilke. Then he pressed a fiery hand against the man's chest. This one didn't explode into dust. He folded in half with a chorus of breaking bones, then folded again and again until he was no bigger than a matchbox. Schiller flicked him away, then turned his attention to the other ferals. Even if they hadn't been moving in slow motion, they couldn't have fought him. All her brother did was turn his palms towards the sky, and every feral man, woman and child in sight jerked upwards like a puppet on a string. They came apart as they rose, limbs popping loose, clothes and skin torn into patchwork, teeth and fingernails spinning free, all linked by spirals of blood, rising until they were as tiny as distant birds, and then vanishing. Time seemed to remember itself then, wrapping its fingers around Rilke and pulling her to the floor. Her ears popped, her heart juddering for a handful of beats before finding its rhythm. Marcus squirmed on the ground before noticing that his attackers were gone, while Jade sat in a heap, her eyes glazed, a little more of her sanity rubbed away. Rilke scrabbled to her feet, planting her hands on her knees to stop herself from falling again. "All of it," she said. She coughed, said it again. "All of it, Schill. We don't want to leave anything." He looked at her, those unblinking eyes like portals to another world. Staring into them brought on a creeping kind of madness, one that made her sick to her stomach. The vibration in the air intensified, and she could feel a finger of blood wind its way down from her ear. But she didn't look away. "Now, Schiller," she said again. And it was her brother who broke, his head dropping. He didn't even move this time, but all the same the landscape dismantled itself just as it had done in Hemingway and Hemsby. Caravans lifted off the ground, doors and windows flapping like agitated limbs as they shook themselves into dust. Chalets crumbled as though made from sand, dropping crumbs as they passed overhead. Cars and bikes and pushchairs broke apart with muffled clanks and rings. Rilke watched them go, a tide of matter that flowed above them like a river, heading over the dunes and out to sea. Schiller lowered his arms, and the remains of the holiday park dropped with a roar like thunder. The water churned into a rage. Rilke felt the salt spray on her face, and she wiped it away. She hated the smell of the sea. Maybe if Schiller dropped enough into it, then it would dry up, earth and ocean both wiped clean. She turned to him when the echoes had died away, seeing the flames ebb from his skin, the wings folding and fading. As always, his eyes were the last to return to normal, the blazing orange giving way to watery blue. He reeled to one side, and she only just reached him before he fell. She lowered him gently to the floor, brushing his hair out of his eyes. "You did well, little brother," she whispered. "You kept us safe." He looked half dead, but her words drew a smile. Marcus crouched down beside them, pulling a bottle of water from his rucksack. They had gathered supplies back in Hemsby before Schiller had razed the little town to the ground. Rilke took the bottle from him, unscrewing the cap and holding it to her brother's lips. He drank deep, as though trying to quench a fire that still burned inside him. "Thanks, Schill," said Marcus. "I didn't think I was getting out of that one." Rilke took a sip of water herself, then handed the bottle back. "Nothing will happen to us," she said. "We're too important." "I know," Marcus replied, but he was frowning. "What?" she snapped. She was exhausted. They hadn't slept since Fursville. They'd tried on the way to Hemsby in a hollow between the dunes, but the police had found them after about half an hour, and Schiller had been forced to take care of them. They'd been on the move ever since, and the police had apparently decided to leave them alone. Either that or there were no police left nearby. Her brother had shown them absolutely no mercy. "Nothing, Rilke," Marcus said. "It's just there are so many of them, and some of them were kids." Her anger boiled up her throat, but she clamped her mouth shut before it could break free. She couldn't blame Marcus for having doubts, even with everything that he had seen. It wasn't as though she hadn't had moments of denial herself, as the crowds had disintegrated before her eyes, especially the children. There had been babies here too, newborns with wrinkled faces who had screamed with a fury they could never hope to understand. But the truth was unmistakable and inescapable. They were here to humble the human race, to make it understand that there was a higher power, that the illusion of free reign, of impunity, was just that, an illusion. They were the angels of death, the great flood and the cleansing fire. People were bad. Rilke knew that better than anyone. They're all like him, like the bad man, she thought, thinking of her mother's doctor, his bad breath and his greedy fingers. Deep down they all have secrets. They're all rotten. Marcus was just having doubts, because he hadn't turned yet, that was all. As soon as his angel hatched, then he'd see the truth. Schiller had turned, and he knew. "We're doing the right thing, aren't we, little brother?" she said. But it wasn't a question. Schiller looked at her with those big, sad eyes, eventually nodding. "I think so," he said. "You know so," Rilke suddenly remembered. Rilke suddenly remembered an incident a few years ago when she and Schiller had been playing at home. She didn't remember what exactly, just that they were both running, and she'd knocked one of their mother's china dolls from the sideboard in the dining room. It had broken into 1,000 pieces, and for an instant her life was over. Their mother was just starting to lose it back then, the insanity slowly rotting the foundations of her mind, and she loved those dolls more than she loved her own children. Breaking one was a serious crime, one punishable by a beating. So she convinced Schiller to take the blame. He had argued at first. He was more scared of their mother than she was, but he was weak, always weak, and it didn't take long to break him. By the time they walked upstairs and Schiller confessed his crime, Rilke was sure that he actually believed he was guilty. Why was she thinking about that now? "You know so," she said again, smoothing a hand over his head. When she lifted it, there were clumps of his hair woven between her fingers like seaweed, and she wiped them off on her skirt. "Trust me, Schiller." He tried to push himself up, but didn't have the strength, dropping onto his back. His forehead was slick with sweat, his skin grey. "It's just tiredness," she told herself. "We just need to find somewhere to rest, to sleep." But there was another thought there too. It's killing him. She pushed it aside. What Schiller had inside him was a miracle, something good. It made him strong, it kept him safe. It wouldn't do anything to hurt him. "I see things," her brother said, looking up at the sky. "When it happens, when I turn, I see things." "Like what?" Rilke asked. "I don't know," he said after a moment. "It's something bad. It's like a man, but a bad man. I can't see his face, only, I don't know, it's like he's living inside a tornado or something. I keep seeing him, Rilke. He scares me." "Forget about it, little brother," she said. But she had seen him too in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, a creature even more powerful than her brother, the man in the storm. "It's one of us," she said. "It's here for the same reason we are. Don't worry about it. He's on our side." Schiller seemed to chew on her words, but not for long. Never for long. "You broke the doll, Schill. It was your fault it smashed, but it's okay because I'll be with you when you tell Mother. I'm always here for you. I love you. You're a good boy. Tell her you broke it." "You're a good boy, Schill," she said, as she smoothed her hand down his shirt. "We'll get through this together. You know I'm always here for you." He nodded, and the park fell silent. Even the sea seemed subdued, the small waves barely making a sound as they lapped against the shore. "It's scared of us," she thought. "It wants us to leave." "I'm really tired, Rilke," Schiller said. "Can we stop?" "Soon," she replied, "when we find a safe place." This would be so much easier if she had turned too, but the angel inside her showed no sign of hatching. The only reason she even knew it was there was because of the headaches she'd suffered. Thump, 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 and then the fury. It was there, though, and sooner or later she would be born again with the same powers as her brother. And when that happened... Rilke grinned, the thought blasting away the last scraps of exhaustion. She got to her feet, pulling Schiller up beside her. The world had never seemed so big, and they had so much work to do. "One more town, little brother. Can you do that?" He sighed, then nodded. "Good boy." She waited for Marcus and Jade to hoist up the new kid, letting him hang between them. They were shivering, but they knew better than to argue with her. Rilke held her brother's arm, taking some of his weight, and together they set off across the ruined land, kicking up the dust of the dead behind them. There we go, we'll leave it there. I have no idea what page we're on because obviously I'm not reading from a book. I could have sworn there was another chapter there. Maybe it got cut from the British edition as well. It had like an Apache helicopter attack. It was really cool. It might come up later on. If not, I'll read it to you at the end. I hope you enjoyed that. It's lovely to be back here with you. And yeah, I'll see you probably, maybe not tomorrow or the next day because kids' parties. My daughter's, one turns 5 today. One turns 7 on Tuesday. Hi girls, if you're ever watching this. And one turned 11 just after Christmas. And but they're parties. We're having 2 parties this weekend. Oh, kids' parties. Lots and lots of fun, but hard work. If you're a grown-up. Anyway, have a great weekend, whatever you're up to. And yeah, I'll catch up with you again soon. Take care of yourselves. And, Happy New Year. I said that already, didn't I? I'm going to stop talking now. Love you guys. Bye.